Moment. What do you do to remember? Sunday morning, I sat learning with a student who will soon be bat mitzvah. We were talking about, as we all do with our b'nai mitzvah, who she is as a Jew at this point in her life. She spoke about preschool. She grew up here at our preschool. We had one. She talked about cooking with her grandmother, about holidays. And then she started talking about her mom's journey to the United States. You see, her mother was born in the Soviet Union. And we talked a little bit about the realities for Jews at that time in the Soviet Union, how being Jewish was forbidden, how practicing Judaism could cause you to lose your job, be sent to prison, or literally to Siberia. The bat mitzvah student heard her mom, perhaps for the first time, talk about how she, the mother, learned for the first time she was Jewish. She was walking down the street with her father, and there was a sign or something that she noticed, and she said to her father, "Well, that's for other people, for people who are Jewish." And she was told, "Well, we're Jewish." She was surprised. And then the bat mitzvah student's father and I told her about the march in 1987, the protest that happened in Washington, D.C. Who here was there? Thank you, Ariane. A few others. As you may recall, in 1987, President Reagan and Premier Gorbachev were about to meet, and what ended up being 250,000 people showed up on the mall to protest the Soviet government. They were saying that they needed to let the Jews who wanted to leave the Soviet Union out. Interestingly, that was a rally that was supposed to get maybe a few thousand people. And the bat mitzvah girl's father and I told her about that rally. We both had powerful memories of being there. At the end of our meeting, I turned to my student and said, "Forget all the writing I told you to do for next week. I want you to go home and talk to your family. Go hear the stories, some of which you know, but you don't know all, and now you're old enough to understand them more." Later that day, it was a busy Sunday, I visited the Illinois Holocaust Museum with a group of our NSCI 7th graders and their parents. These students have been studying the Shoah, the Holocaust, and learning about anti-Semitism here in their 7th grade class. And our docent, the museum docent who has been teaching them here, was our guide at the museum. So we went through the museum. He talked through the exhibits, the history beginning from before World War II, and covered in a very intense short time the realities of immigration, the possible decisions of families, and so much in the exhibits, including acts of resistance. We then were blessed to hear a survivor, a man who had left Germany on kinder transport and had gone to England. He talked about his family's story and his survival. At the end of our visit, we told our 7th grade students that they now have his story to tell. They now have the responsibility to bear witness to the story they just heard, to teach others, and to make sure that others know it, that we remember the Holocaust. The Shabbat is a Sabbath of remembrance, literally called Shabbat Zachor, or the Sabbath of Remembrance, the Shabbat before Purim every year. We read a special portion of Torah that recalls the story of the Amalekites, a rogue band of enemies to our ancestors who attacked our ancestors, their most vulnerable parts, on their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. The Shabbat is set aside to remember the evil done by Amalek, and it is set aside deliberately before Purim. We're told in a very small passage of verses we're to blot out Amalek's name and to remember what happened and to not forget. When Torah repeats without frequency, we know it really means it. In a few days, we'll turn to Purim. Of course, on Purim, we remember an evil that almost happened, but thank God did not. And we celebrate, big-time celebration, a celebration of utter joy and merrymaking, as the Megillah tells us. But one could ask, isn't this a confusing pair of messages? It's actually perfect, and if you think about Judaism, a perfectly Jewish pair of messages. Remembering is at our essence. We remember Shabbat each week, we remember our history, our mitzvot, our commandments, and we remember through our holidays. And if you think about it, remembering in Judaism is no passive thing. It's not about sitting in your armchair and just saying, I remember this now. Think about it. We're told in Torah to remember that we were slaves in Egypt. We were strangers in Egypt. To remember the needy and disadvantaged in our midst. To remember through our action. And throughout our tradition, too, we celebrate our victories. And we should. We should do so with great joy. But our victory should never overshadow or cause us to forget our history. Some of that history being shown this week, the story of Purim and the story of the Amalekites. So think about it. How do we remember as Jews? We remember when we protect the vulnerable and when we speak out in the face of attack. We remember when we act, when we see injustice and we act. When we do so, we do indeed blot out Amalek and his descendant Haman, and we make a difference in our day. When we remember as Jews, it's not a passive thing. It's an active thing. Hillel asked us, if not now, when? So this Shabbat and tomorrow and the next day and the next day, let us remember with action.